All right, so shall we start? Last week we were discussing the Industrial Revolution and its outcomes. Today, I'd like us to talk about colonialism, imperialism. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. We shall see what the definitions are, but it's broadly another country controlling the affairs of another country. And so the places we'll be talking about include, so most of the world that was colonized is what we call the third world. Well, we don't call it the third world because that is just rude. The global south. And so we'll talk about Africa, Southeast Asia, Middle East, India, and China. And so this is where you find most colonies. So I want you to think about this for a minute. Is the United States a colonial power? Yes? Yes? Maybe? But colonialism is invading other people and putting your people there and running their governments and other systems. So yes, the United States has had colonial tendencies. For example, in Cuba in 1898, after the Spanish-American War, in the Philippines, some people would say Guam, Puerto Rico, and other countries, well, other territories like Hawaii. But so there's differing opinions on this. But what a lot of the colonialism we'll be talking about occurred in Africa and Southeast Asia, so not Russia, because that's sort of like north. We did talk about Saudi Arabia and how it establishes itself during the Ottoman Empire's rule. But so Africa, East Asia, Australia, even though Australia is more like the US, it's like the British settled in Australia and New Zealand and displaced in the inhabitants. So depending on how you think about colonialism, you can see that as colonialism. After all, the United States began as the 13 colonies. So we shall be talking about this and some of the earlier colonizers. And so when we think about colonialism, again, countries don't always think of themselves as colonialists. I hesitate to wade into very controversial issues. For example, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. But sometimes there's a question of whether Israel is a colonizer and whether it's colonizing Gaza and the West Bank, particularly after the partition of 1947. So if you ask Palestinians, they'll probably say they've been colonized by Israel. If you ask Israelis, they'll probably say they are eradicating terrorism. But again, we should maybe make a note that the British called George Washington a terrorist. So they kind of have this, who defines who a terrorist is also another question. Now, I like this map because there's actually a bunch of maps like this about perception, how the average American sees the world. There's one of how Reagan saw the United States. And so apparently there was California, the middle, and New York. So if you actually think about this, even though we shouldn't be thinking about people's savagery, I think this is like, think about China. What do we think about China? Communism and all this stuff comes from there. Yeah. Greenland, what is there other than... Yeah, I think there's some people that live there maybe. Iceland, IKEA. But so when we call people colonialists, sometimes they are not very happy with that. But so this is the definition of colonialism. So you can see the idea of a system. So colonialism is a system. People from one country settle in another, but they maintain connections to the mother country. When we talked about the 13 colonies, we mentioned that 40% of those who lived in the 13 colonies were loyalists. In other words, their loyalty was to the King of England. 40% were sort of they agitated for self-determination, and 20% were somewhere in there. So, but the important thing is when we talk about the 13 colonies, colonies of what or who? So, colonies of the British. And so, another definition is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. So that would qualify for the 13 colonies. I don't know if it also applies to what the US was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. But if you're acquiring full or partial political control, then you can sort of see how that is colonialism. Now, today we don't really use the term colonialism. We use more politically correct terms. For example, non-self-governing. So, territories that are not self-governing, and this list is according to the United Nations. So Western Sahara is below Morocco, which is kind of affiliated with Spain. Gibraltar is at the southern tip of Spain, which belongs to the UK, which is a very weird thing. But you'll find actually that different countries maintain very unusual territories. So, for example, the French control Réunion, which is off of the coast of Africa near Madagascar. And you're thinking, but France is over there in Europe. Why? Now, same thing with Gibraltar. It's at the southern tip of Spain, controlled by the British. And you're thinking, why do the British own that? But also they control the Malvinas Islands, which are off Argentina. Actually went to war with Argentina over the Malvinas, which is what the Argentinians call the islands, the British call them the Falkland Islands. So it's weird. Now other Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Montserrat. So a lot of this we probably know. French Polynesia, French Guyana, which is in South America. So if you actually look at who the leader of French Polynesia is, it's Emmanuel Macron, who is the French president, which is sort of like, Now these last three are the ones that the U.S. controls, so American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. There's a difference between American Samoa and Samoa, and so there's also like what is called freely associated states, like Federated States of Micronesia, affiliated with the U.S. So again, thinking about colonialism is not necessarily such an obvious thing. Now, we did talk a lot about the Ottoman Empire and the Europeans taking it apart. So some of those processes. The Suez Canal was built in 1869, well actually from about 1860, and part of the Suez Canal's building was to facilitate access to the Middle East and to East Asia. I do hope you're following developments, because everything that happened yesterday is now history. And so ships are having to sail around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa because the Suez Canal that opens into the Red Sea has a lot of issues with the Yemeni rebels. So again, even though it was built that long ago, we still see geopolitics affecting its use. But so let's talk about some of the imperialism that we get to see. Some of this will sound repetitive because we did talk about the Algerians taking over, the French taking over Algeria. Actually, the French were horrible colonialists. They took over Algeria and they were like, yeah, we own this. We are making it part of France and there's nothing you can do about it. But so the way that Algeria was part of the Ottoman Empire in the north of Africa. And so when we see the beginning of imperialism against the Ottoman Empire, some of the territories that are taken include Greece. So Greece becomes independent. Algeria is taken over by the French and Tunisia is established. Now, so the story of the colonialism of Algeria is actually sort of reminiscent of what Europeans were doing. They find a pretext to fight you. So, for example, in Algeria, they said that their representative was insulted by the Algerian representative to the Ottoman Empire, and so they asked for reparations, trade concessions. If you remember when we discussed the Opium Wars, so think about the treaties that ended the Opium Wars. They were what we called unequal treaties. And so this is what we also see here. The French are asking for things that are impossible, unreasonable to give. And so, yeah, the French thought this was not okay, and they sent their fleet to Algiers. They demanded that the debt that they owed the Ottoman Empire be cancelled, which is sort of like maybe coercion. And so eventually France will make Algeria a colony in 1834. Algeria will become independent in 1961 after a very prolonged war that killed almost 1 million French. And so we do see, so there was that element of we are just taking over your stuff, but there was also the new like direct colonialism, naked colonialism. There has been questions of what the role of religion was in colonialism, missionaries, and I will tell you there was a significant role. It's almost like the missionaries mapped some of the places that there were, and so if you actually study colonialism, it doesn't begin with colonialism itself. It begins with Christianity and then moves on to trade. And then we see total control. So we do see new imperialism. So again, we mentioned how Europeans sometimes helped the Ottoman Empire, but also sometimes took it apart. So for example, Europeans, French, they take over Algeria, they establish Tunisia. But in 1856, they actually support the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. So it really reminds us of what Kissinger said: countries have no permanent friends or enemies, only interests. And so when their interests were... So we do see dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. But we also see a period of government takeover. So initially we see trading companies that were involved in these colonies, but eventually we see governments taking over. For example, the British government. Now, colonialism did include territorial conquest, sometimes direct colonialism, but we shall also maybe talk about some of the worst colonizers, maybe not right today, but yeah. So the victims of colonialism included the Middle East and North Africa, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And some of the worst or the most prolific colonizers included Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain. There's actually about 14 powers that were represented when, yeah. So India is one of the most important colonies that the British obtained and controlled for almost 100 years. And if you sort of think about why India was attractive to the British, first, their economy contributed, the economy accounted for about 20 something percent of the world economy in 1800. And so if you control the source of these goods, then that is probably good for you. Now, again, India was, and this is endemic, before countries took over, we see the trading posts. So you see, for example, Portuguese, British settlements, French settlements, Dutch settlements, Danish settlements. So they would establish these settlements rather than colonies. But eventually they would take over so that you control, instead of just waiting to buy goods, you actually force people to make the goods, and then you can sell them at profit. One of the perhaps worst, we'll see a lot of deception in colonialism. But again, when we think about the missionaries and then the traders and then the colonialists, India was a very particular, interesting case. We did talk about the British East India Company, the one that was delivering opium, and then eventually led to the Opium Wars. And so the British East India Company traded, even though it was called East India, it traded around the world. It's the one that brought the tea that was dumped in the Boston Harbor. So again, it's not like they just traded in India. And so we also talked about the 7 Years' War. Now, one of its impacts was that the British controlled India. So they kicked out all these other, during the period, and this might be interesting to keep in mind, when you fought people, you took all their stuff, which is why, for example, during the Spanish-American War of 1898, the US took over Cuba, but also took the Philippines, which belonged to Spain. Now, I think that is a terrible idea because when you take over a country, you sort of have to govern it. And, a lot of literature says that colonies were not even economically feasible. But 1757, Robert Clive defeats the India of, the one that the country, not the people. So defeats Indians and the French and establishes sort of a British control over India. And so this will actually force the French to find other territories, which is what we shall see them do in the French Indochina. So, of course, there's a lot of colonialism has those representations of, I think, the perceptions of what people and places are. So you can see some prince riding an elephant, the British flag, of course, and perhaps the defeated Indian peoples. But the important thing is that this is where the British colonialism of India begins. Now, the people who initially control India were not government officials. They were actually nabobs, which actually comes from the Urdu name for viceroy. Viceroy is a representative of usually a government, so sort of like an ambassador, but in this case representing the British East India Company. And so you actually have a lot of these individuals making money, living like locals. They sort of adopted the cultures, traditions, dress, and so on. And so nabobs were people who acquired large fortunes during the British rule in India. And so I was looking up images of what a nabob would look like, and that is what came up. So the, yeah, person being carried with his opium pipe, maybe. But so, viceroys employed by the British East India Company. And so these are some of the things that they began to do. Took Indian wives, dressed as Indian princes, wielded power. So think about nabobs as parallels to the Mamluks in the Ottoman Empire. But so the British now control India through the British East India Company, and they are forcing the manufacture and purchase of cotton and other goods, and eventually they'll expand to northern India. So ultimately they are controlling most of India. And so these are actually very useful graphics. So for example, in 1800, India accounted for 20% of the world's trade. China accounted for 33%. So between them, they accounted for more than half of the global trade, actually production. But 100 years later, a century later, they only account for about 10%. So you can sort of see what colonialism does in terms of production. One of the greatest tragedies of colonialism is that it ended the cottage industry, which mostly employed women. So colonialism and industrialization eventually make women and their conditions worse off. But so this is India, and some of the expansions. Some places were left uncolonized. So like what you're seeing as dependent states, states. There were confederacies like Maratha Confederacy, but there were also areas of direct British control. We shall talk about divide and rule. So the British sometimes used direct colonialism, like they literally rule over the local populations. In other places, they used indirect rule. But again, actually, there were very few, so that makes sense. So we want to think about imperialism in the context of globalization and Western developments and industrialism, the decline in the trade opportunities and production opportunities in India and China. But also colonialism had a good, it's probably a terrible thing to say, but it had a secondary outcome, and this particularly involved, like if you're colonizing a place, you are also creating a market for your goods. So you're creating a source of labor, but also a market for your goods. And so this is kind of what the British were doing. But we do see them expand very significantly around India and other places. Now, there was, so initially when we started these discussions about world civilizations, we talked about why some places were colonized, or why the Europeans wanted to go out there. And we mentioned three things that you can cast as either Christianity, civilization, and commerce, or God, glory, and gold. Now, and again, as I mentioned, especially Protestant missionaries were at the forefront of spreading the gospel. I guess this is a good thing because we still do it today. We have, religious missions going off to Africa to do stuff. So there was this perception that there was need to civilize and Christianize and Christian peoples. Apparently also abolition of slavery, to enforce workers' rights, to produce electoral reform. And so these were some of the things that missionaries believed they were doing or said they were doing. Now, on the one hand, I kind of agree that there are some things that maybe shouldn't have happened. So, for example, sati is, I don't know if we have another image for sati. So, yeah, sati is the practice of cremation. So you will probably know that most Hindus cremate their dead before, I'm not sure I'll say before what, but if, for example, you are married and your husband died, you were required to, like, when he's being cremated, you're supposed to be cremated with him, even though you're alive, which kind of feels weird. Actually, it's super weird. Because it didn't also apply to women. I mean, if your wife died, you found another one. You didn't cremate yourself. So, again, when you think about those kinds of practices, probably not. So, the practice of sati. And so the British are making the point that they are abolishing harmful barbaric customs and so on. But they're also, really super focused on trade, and they are doing quite maybe a bit of trading. So that was probably more of the incentive than. But again, we can say that each of the three groups, missionaries, traders, and the government, had interests in colonizing some of these places. So missionaries do spread Christianity around the world. There are questions of whether they were more missionary than spies or cartographers. So they are mapping out places, rivers, territory, geography, and so this will be later used for by colonialists, navigation, and those kinds of things. Now, in most of these representations, you'll see sort of the difference in dress that is probably attempted to be shown to be superior. So Western missionaries dressed in modernity. If you remember that image we had of Columbia, and what, how Columbia was represented as a goddess, but also as progress. And so we also see this with the missionaries, but also British smugness or righteousness. So Thomas Macaulay writes that a single shelf of European books is worth more than all the literatures of Asia and Arabia. Now, I don't know how many books the British had, but if you actually think about the literatures of, for example, China had been around for about 2,000 some years, and so, but this is really representative of the kind of thinking that we see in colonization. So the idea is that the British were bringing civilization, most Europeans actually, but so over time we see that colonized peoples will begin to resist. We saw this with the United States, the 13 colonies. We'll see this around the world. And so one of the most significant events in India's history was the Great Rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny, or the Great Mutiny, which is also considered to be India's first war of independence. And so the cause was, and you can, so the British divide and rule kind of, maybe we need to briefly talk about India and some of its demographics. So India used to be the Mughal Empire, Mughal. It was both Hindu and Muslim. And so for the British, what they would do is like find an area that was predominantly Hindu, and then they'd bring in Muslims to rule over the Hindus. Now that right there creates a schism, because the majority of the Hindus are being ruled by their religious enemies. And so the British this way kind of kept order, because then the Muslims would identify more with the British than with their fellow Indian peoples. But also, knowing some of these cultural customs was important and exploited. So, for example, the sepoys were the troops or the soldiers that were hired by the British East India Company. Now, we talked about the Industrial Revolution. We see the rise of new guns, technologies, and so some of those guns required greasing. So think about gun oil, but they kind of didn't really use gun oil then. So what did they use? They used cow fat, grease, um, or pig fat to grease the cartridges. Now, the problem with doing that is that, for example, if you give Hindus um, cow grease, that offends their religion. If you give Muslims uh, pig grease to grease their cartridges, that offends their religion too. So it's almost like the British were offending everyone around them. And so part of this is like, we came here to civilize you, to change you. There's nothing wrong with a pig or a cow, But so the idea was there was a British strategy here. And part of the strategy was to make the soldiers unclean, because if you are a Muslim and you used, pig grease, then you're probably unclean. And so you're ripe for conversion to Christianity. It's amazing what the Christian church did. Yeah, but anyway, so there was this mutiny. The Sepoys rebel, and they're like, yeah, we are not working for the British or the British East India Company anymore. And yeah, so, but there was other issues like, whether to restore Bahadur Shah Zafar in some random principality, kind of like European wars. But the outcome is what is more important for us. Now, this image is so apparently the way the British punished the mutineers, the British East India Company, was to tie them to the front of a cannon and then fire the cannon. Yeah, I think that was absolutely horrific. Yeah, and made other soldiers watch. So why anyone would do that? Anyway, so the rebels are executed, and this information gets back to Queen Victoria, who is appalled because she's like, is that what the British East India Company is doing? Is that what we, the British, are doing? And so the British decide that they are going to end the role of British East India Company, and they are going to actually administer the colony themselves. Now, so as I mentioned, there were other issues with India's first war of independence, but I also often like to highlight important individuals in history, particularly women. So Lakshmi Bai was a queen of Jhansi. Her husband dies, and she was actually very active in the Indian First War of Independence. But again, if you look at this, which will not be on a test, sort of think about how the British were sort of manipulating people, kingdoms, princes, alliances, and so on. And so again, it's important to highlight the heroes of liberation, and we'll talk about some of that. So the outcome of the Great Sepoy Mutiny. Indian civil service is created in 1858 so that they could govern India, dismantle the British East India Company, and sort of now began to impose direct rule. Now, creating the Indian civil service, the idea was that we are now going to give you jobs so you have some money, and the British East India Company is no longer doing that. And so Queen Victoria says that the British would no longer impose their convictions on any of their subjects, even though they control them, they colonize them. So, but in my view, the Indian civil service was a classic Trojan horse. a Trojan horse because it is a Indian civil service that produced Mahatma Gandhi, who would become very instrumental in the independence of India. So I don't know if that was a very smart move. Now, ultimately, this is the British rule in India, and so you can sort of see that it's not all controlled by the British. There's all kinds of different um, territories. So, for example, Nepal, Kashmir to the northwest. Kashmir is very contested. In fact, India and Pakistan have gone to war 3 times over Kashmir. So, again, some of these are the vestiges of colonialism. Like Kashmir was majority Hindu, but was ruled by a Muslim prince. And so, when eventually the British Raj became independent, there was a question of the population is majority Hindu, but their ruler is Muslim. So does it go to Pakistan or to India? But we'll talk about independence So the direct rule, you kind of took over and administered everything. So sometimes the US kind of did that in like Iraq and Afghanistan. But what the British were doing was to appoint local people who owed them allegiance, and so that is what indirect rule was. The idea was to have a large army to avoid mutinies, but also not too large an army. And so, as I mentioned, divide and rule that exploited social, economic, ethnic, and religious divisions was one of the strategies to administer these colonies. And so, for example, they brought about, so they would elevate Muslims, where Hindus were the majority, and Muslims where Hindus were the majority. But they also messed with the Indian caste system. So the caste system has like 5 different groups of people, and the untouchables, the Dalits, are the lowest. So what the British would do is elevate the Dalits to rule over the Brahmins. The Brahmins are the priests. And so this clearly causes serious challenges because it's sort of like you are taking the untouchables and making them rule over us. So this had the effect of the Indian peoples are fighting each other, not the British, because it's sort of like, I can't believe I'm a Brahmin and a Dalit is ruling over me. But so they also did other things that resonate today. So for example, not sure if you've heard of the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas are in Myanmar, which used to be Burma. And so apparently they were imported from Bangladesh. And so today, so when Myanmar became independent, Myanmar was like, we don't know who the Rohingyas are. They are Bangladeshi. They need to go back. So today, the Rohingyas are stateless peoples. The Myanmar government doesn't recognize them. It's sort of like they have to go somewhere, but where do they go? And so this is a vestige of, because they were imported by the British into Burma. So again, this is an element of we are going to take the minority, have them rule over the majority, and there's nothing anyone can do. So the British Empire in India eventually looks like this, but you can also see that the British colonized other people. They try to colonize Afghanistan, but rarely does anyone succeed in colonizing Afghanistan. Burma was colonized. They tried with Siam, Thailand. That didn't hold. But then to the southeast, they also controlled Malaysia and so on. So one of the outgrowths of the civil service was the Indian National Congress. So this would become the Congress Party, not the one that is ruling today, which is BJP. But so the Indian National Congress is really credited with pushing for Indian independence in the early 20th century. People like Mahatma Gandhi or Mohandas Gandhi. Some of the other outcomes we see of British colonization is a lot of decimation of wildlife resources. So hunting those tigers that are a little rare today. Now, so divide and rule. The basis of divide and rule was to pick the minority and have them rule over the majority. This wasn't just a British thing. It was also Belgian and French and other people's thing. If you've heard of the Rwandan genocide, this was 30 years after Rwanda became independent. And so what the colonialists had done in that case is take the Tutsis, who were 15% of the population, and elevated them over the Hutus, who were about 85%. And so when independence comes, it's a question of why are the minority ruling over us? And so we see these kinds of divide and rule tactics in India with Rajputs and Gurkhas and Sikhs and so on. So eventually we are going to see the independence of India. We'll talk about that at some point. But I want us to transition to other places that became colonized. And so again, colonized or controlled, I am not necessarily certain, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, even though there is a removal or suppression of the existing populations. So Australia is a most interesting country because its first 50,000 British residents were actually convicts. Now, we are not saying that they were convicts of criminal activities. Some of them were political prisoners, some of them were just bums, some of them were, But so after the first 50 years, the population that was going to Australia was more of farmers, ranchers, investors, and so on. So when we think about Australia and New Zealand, close together, it's so the Dutch navigators do stumble upon Western Australia in 1606, but it was actually claimed for the British by Captain James Cook. And so because of the terrain and the remoteness, initially it was thought of as a good place to ship convicts. So it was what we would call a penal colony. You establish a place, you're shipping. There was a lot of that. So for example, we talked about being Barbados, which was being sent to the Barbados to do hard labor as a punishment. But so besides the convicts, we see the immigration of free British subjects. And so we kind of see them being in farming. You will probably know that the Australian seasons are the reverse of what is here. So for example, I think their summer is just ending. But it was a good place to do farming. In fact, at some point, 50% of British wool needs were supplied from Australia. We have talked about the challenges of wool in that wool doesn't dry up quickly, so you probably need more of cotton. But we see the cultivation in sugar and rice and other things. Again, the British are sort of repeating the whole American thing of using indentured labor from the Pacific Islands. So we also see Australia being a good source of gold. So we see the gold rush, think California. And so we do see white population that reached about 5 million in 1914, but this is at the expense of Aborigines, the native Australians. Actually, Australia intended to wipe out Aborigines. From about 1914, they took Aborigine babies and placed them with white families to make them more Christian, civilized, and maybe. But so we actually see the decline of Aborigines. Again, some of the same reasons: diseases, confrontations, and defense and loss of hunting and gathering lands. So again, you see what happens to Aborigines being parallel to what happens to Native Americans. But it wasn't all easy down south. There were, even though there is an increase in Australian population, we see some challenges. Some of them were economic, some of them were administrative, but some of them were also connected with what was happening globally. So, for example, the dry and wet cycles. Not sure how much you know about some of these things, but we are currently in an El Nino season, which is characterized by lots and lots of rain. And so we see Australia continuing to do some changes. Now, what we might be aware of, maybe, is that Australia, as a modern country, actually has the head of state for Australia is the Queen. So even though it became independent in like the 1900, it's still a dominion of the British, together with New Zealand and Canada and some other places. But so we do see some of these labor reforms, old age pension, a federal constitution, and so on. But Australia had some of these same tendencies as other places. So, for example, think of Jim Crow South, hanging of civilians. So the kind of justice that was meted out on the natives was very pro-white Australians. And so again, you invaded people's territory, and what do you think they're going to do? Same thing happened to New Zealand, and I do hope you watch global events. I think there was a World Cup, maybe last year, that was in New Zealand and Australia, and a lot of the before the soccer matches, you would see a lot of Maori, especially Maori and Aborigine cultural things. So New Zealand was especially inhabited by the Maoris, Maori. And so actually New Zealand apologized for what it did to the Maoris in the during the colonization, because again, they were decimated. I think this is a good sort of so the Polynesians who inhabited New Zealand were called Maoris, farmers. They had settlements. So their decimation was very bloody, because from about 100,000, there was a time when the population was about 40,000 in 1840. So you can see more than half the population is killed in these conflicts with ranchers and other people. So some of what facilitated colonialism was the Industrial Revolution, new weapons, new technologies, that the colonies did not necessarily have. So when you think about the Middle East, Africa, Asia, these were the places that kind of did not have this access to these technologies, even though some other places did. Now, not the Sudan. The Sudan, we mentioned the Maxim machine gun and how 20,000 Sudanese were killed by a force of about 1 to 2,000 British, because the British had the machine guns, and sometimes people just charged the machine guns. One of the most significant losses for the Europeans during colonization was Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. So, 1896, the Italians tried to take over Abyssinia, Ethiopia. They already controlled Eritrea, so they wanted to expand south. They would repeat this in 1935, but so the Italians were defeated by the Abyssinians, which is huge. It's a scandal. It's a shame. The Italians didn't erase until about 1935. So we do see a lot of imperialism, not just in Australia, India, but also in the Middle East. In places like Egypt, in places like the Sudan. But so again, imperialist competition, we will see how this will change. But so especially the British Empire from about 1814 became the leading imperial power and naval power until 1914. And so particularly the post-Napoleonic Wars, this is that period, and so the Europeans are expanding outwards. But also this is a period when the discussions on abolishing slavery are going on, and so where do you get labor? You get it from the colonies. Now, not that we talked about the French and the conquest of Algeria, but also, again, you can see how these issues played out. So, for example, the British supported Algerian leaders against the French. Now, again, this might have been a vestige of the Napoleonic Wars. But yeah, so Algeria becomes a French colony. This is apparently a map of the shelling of Algiers. Again, you can see it's still the era of warships. Now, the British did try to invade Afghanistan, as I mentioned before. That didn't end very well. This is the person who is most associated with that scandal. So they actually fought two wars, the first Anglo-Afghan War and the second Anglo-Afghan War. And so the British did kind of not succeed. And so if you think about a map of Southeast Asia, India, they controlled, and so it made sense to try and control Afghanistan. Now, it was, so far we haven't talked about countries like Germany and imperialism necessarily what they did. But again, if you go back to the formation of states, this is the time they were consolidating. So for example, Germany was consolidating in 1870 to 71 and getting ready to start fighting other people. So by 1914, this is what the map of the world looked like. Other than the United States, quite a bit of South America, China, and some countries in the Middle East, a lot of the rest of the world was really colonized by the British, the Danish, the Dutch, French, Germans, and so on. And so you can sort of see there were many colonizers. And, in the next class period, we shall look at British, well, actually some of the other colonialism in some of the other places. Now,